welcome to episode 5 of Deep Weird. As always, I'm Jacob Bittman. Last week, we grounded ourselves a little bit, had a more skeptical approach, and took a much more hard science skeptical look at these kinds of things. Today, I'm going to be giving you complete whiplash by giving you by far the most bizarre story that anyone called in with for this show. Today, we're going to be talking to Riley, who has what I would describe as an old school 1950s, 1960s ultra-terrestrial humanoid encounter. It's very odd. I have personally never heard of anything described the way that Riley describes it. And I have heard who knows how many dozens and dozens and dozens of these kinds of stories all over the internet. I messaged some of the top UFO and paranormal podcasters and stuff on Twitter, and I got a reply from a couple. They had no idea. Riley gave me a picture that he drew of this thing, and I will make sure that picture gets posted probably on the Twitter at Deep Weird Pod. So go over there and check that out. I'll see if I can post it in some other places too. And I know that you're excited to just hear the story at this point, so let's hand it off to Riley.
My name is Riley. Just Riley at this, if that's fine. I work as a lab technician, more specifically as a microbiologist at a milk plant, and I've been doing that for the last 2 years. I did not graduate, but I was going to school. I did go through college for about 3.5 years, and then afterwards is when I started working or started my career. And in and out of that time, both before school and after and during my working time is when I've had a lot of these experiences.
So, without burying the lead, you have been sort of like, I guess some people would say haunted a little bit to some extent. I almost said stalked, but that seems a little bit too menacing. You've been harassed a little bit by this very odd sounding being that I've never heard of before. And I emailed the picture that you sent me, or I DM'd the picture that you sent me to like several other big time paranormal investigators. So far, only one of them has replied, and he said that he's never seen anything like it either, so, or heard of it, anything like it either.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I mean, I've also looked into a lot of this, and I've come across similarities, but nothing ever exact. So, no, I think that this is, I think haunting is an appropriate term to be described with it. And this is just in my case, it is something I've dealt with and I'm used to. So but I understand that this is extraordinary.
Why don't you just start with like the first encounter, and then we can go into we can attempt to explain what this thing looks like, which is actually kind of difficult to do.
Yeah, no, even when you see it, it's just kind of blurry. But no, yeah, of course, absolutely. So I can just kind of give you a general timeline of what happened or the details of the day. So, first time that I've had this encounter was when I was in high school. I want to go ahead and say that this was late 2014, maybe even early 2015. This is at the time when, I was a senior. I was getting up early in the morning because, my girlfriend, who was my wife now, she was working at Starbucks. She was working the morning shift. So I would get up at 3 or 4 in the morning. I'd walk over to her place since her house was in walking distance. It took about maybe 10 or 15 minutes to walk over to her. And I would walk with her, which would be about 20 minutes to work, walk back, and just go back to sleep or get ready for the rest of my day, what have you. I have never had sleeping problems in the way of, sleepwalking or anything like that. I've had trouble sleeping before in the past in the sense of sleep apnea or insomnia or anything like that, but never anything to the degree of sleepwalking. So I remember the day in which it happened. Typically, when I get up, I have an alarm set, or I sort of just naturally get up and I get ready and I get out of the house or the apartment I was living in. But I remember on the day, I don't remember getting up or remember going through the notions or the motions of getting up. And I just sort of found myself walking around aimlessly in my apartment complex. I guess I kind of just snapped out of it, or I just woke up kind of from a daze or a fugue of some kind. And, I looked at my phone and I noticed that, like, my girlfriend, like, texted and called me, like, you know, variously, like, every minute or so, just because I was running a little bit late, or I just didn't tell her that I was on my way. And she was obviously just worried since this was, early in the morning or late at night or what have you. So, you know, that was an extremely jarring experience just to kind of find myself awake in the middle of the parking lot. But I just thought, okay, maybe I just got ready, got through the motions, and then I just kind of like snapped out of it. Not too unusual, but out of the norm for me. So I make my way over to her place. I wait outside, I meet her outside. I say, hey, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, be late or anything. And, she doesn't see it as a big deal or anything. We walk. I walk her to work, I drop her off and I'm heading back. And this is at a point in the morning or very late at night, but I'd say more early in the morning. This is the part of the year in which it was still just very dark. So, the sun isn't even out yet. Street lights are still on. The road and the sidewalk is completely empty. Everyone's still asleep. And this is just a normal occurrence for me. It's nothing odd or unusual or particularly scary for me. It's just, I'm just walking back home as I typically do. And as I'm walking on the road, again, the road and the street is completely empty. I see a street light or a lamp, and on the precipice of the light, or right out of the edge of the light, I kind of see a silhouette or a figure or a shape, humanoid in nature, but you know, oddly proportionate. At where I was as I was walking, I didn't really get a good like shape or size of it, just because I just thought, okay, it's just a guy, it's just some guy, maybe he's waiting for the bus or he's just walking out, whatever. Not a big deal. I noticed that he's wearing like a coat or a jacket or a robe of some kind. It wasn't necessarily cold, but, again, just nothing too out of the ordinary. But what really got me was just the abnormal shape. I described it as having kind of a teapot sort of shape. It didn't have a handle or a spout, but like just that shape of it was very asymmetrical. It didn't match from one side. It just was very misshapen or kind of lumpy. And, the closer I get to it, again, I'm just not trying to pay too much attention. I just thought like it's just a guy, it's not a big deal. I'm not gonna freak out, what have you. And, this thing kind of starts to like shimmy or walk or kind of shake over towards the light. It's not necessarily like, it's kind of like it's dragging itself or it's kind of lumbering over. And, I've described it in other instances, the noise it's making, it's kind of like a shattering glass noise, or it's sort of like a chafing between glass, or like a metal kind of sound, like it's creaking or what have you. And as it's entering into the light, and as I'm getting closer to it, and I'm on the same side of the road, on the same sidewalk as it is, as it kind of enters into the light, it like its jacket kind of goes slack, or like it just falls off, or it pushes it off, or what have you. And then from there, I am able to see it in more detail or see it in more shape. And like I said, it was a kind of teapot, oblong, sort of irregular shaped, like, object. And its legs were kind of like these sort of like rubbery knobs, or they were just like kind of these bulbous shaped knobs on either side. And it didn't really have arms, or like the arms it had they seemed like that they were like loose or slack like gloves, like really long, like laboratory gloves on, you know, either side, but they didn't look like they were filled. They were just kind of slack and hanging off the side or what have you. And, this is when it's entered into the light. I'm able to see it more clearly. And I'm describing it, I've described it as kind of transparent. Like it looks like it's made of a glass or a plastic or, one of those like transparent cases you see. And it looks like it's filled with like a liquid or gas of some kind because I'm able to see into it or through it. It's kind of transparent, but it also kind of seems immaterial in some way. And inside of it, with like this liquid or gas, what have you, it just is filled with these other like orbs or at least misshapen, what I would describe as kind of glass organs, if you will, that kind of like swirl around inside of it or kind of just move around in its own independent motion or autonomy or what have you. It doesn't really have a face. Like its head, if you can call it that, is just kind of a really flat sort of like mound or shape on top, but it's able to kind of like project a face, maybe almost holographic, but like something in which it just projects these sort of like irregular lines and blobs and shapes, kind of like a Rorschach, but not really. That's not on it, but it's projecting that from like this kind of mound head structure that it has on top. And as I'm seeing this and as I'm looking at this, I am not like overly scared or terrified, but I do just have like a panic feeling. Like it is just what am I looking at? What am I dealing with? Like it's kind of like panic kind of sets in. But again, it's not like I feel like this thing's going to hurt me or I feel like this thing's going to attack me. It's more of this is just so like out of context situation or issue. And I just try to speed walk or run or walk around it, and I just kind of bolt and make my way. And it didn't really stop or attempt to stop me or say, like, try to like hold me or anything. I just kind of like ran around it and kept going. It was just kind of like a panic. It was like oh my God, what's that? And you kind of just run. And, I've said that it does speak very disjointedly. Like it doesn't really say full phrases.
So this first time though, you didn't get any words out of it, right?
No, this first time it just appeared itself, and then I did a run around, and then I ran away from it.
Okay, so before we get into like the subsequent encounters and like how they seem to sound when like they're talking, I want to try to go over a quick explanation of what it looks like, and I'll have the picture that you drew. I'll post that probably on Twitter and probably also in the Discord. So if you're listening to this, I'll make sure that that's out there somewhere. But if you're having trouble imagining this, sort of picture like almost like the Kool-Aid Man as the body.
Yeah.
But instead of a pitcher opening on the top, it's got like this little cap, and that cap is projecting a face.
Mm-hmm.
Like that doesn't seem like an actual real face or anything, but seems like it's like projecting a fake face where they think a face should be.
Yes.
And then the legs are like 1950s, like Lost in Space robot legs, where it's like the rubber segments.
Yeah, no, that
on the leg. And the arms aren't really arms, they're openings in the side of the Kool-Aid Man jar with like gloves, the way that you see people in factories working on like microchips where their hands go into those gloves.
Yeah. Definitely.
Like those gloves are like the arms on the side, but they're just hanging down as if they could maybe like inflate the glove. So the vibe that you get from this thing, looking at the picture and really like understanding the description, is that it seems like it's like a being that has like a liquid or gaseous body that is in like a suit, is kind of the vibe that I'm getting.
Yeah, definitely. Like it's that the body isn't the thing. It's whatever it's inside, and the body, just like you said, it's a suit or an apparatus of some kind.
Yeah, which the cranks listening to this now will have a lot of opinions about that I will get into in the discussion in the second half of this episode.
Mhm.
Why don't you get into sort of the next side? Because you've seen this thing, I think we figured it was like 5 or 6 times.
Yeah.
Why don't you go into kind of the next encounter, or maybe even like the next most important encounter, and we can sort of get more details, and we can talk a little bit about how you've like interacted with these things.
Yeah, no, of course. So, like you said, and like I've explained, I see this thing very infrequently. I would say every year or every other year. And, since the first time I saw it in 2014, 2015 time, I would say that like you said, I've seen it like every other year. So probably about 5 or 6 times. The last time I made an interaction with this being was last year, late December. I would probably say the 26th or 27th. The time on it is a little slippery just because, like I said, you know, when looking at it, you understand you're dealing with something concrete, but it's very kind of loose and immaterial. Whenever I'm looking at it, it's always when I'm by myself. I don't really have a means to be able to kind of record this appropriately, just because when I'm in those situations, it's kind of a fight or flight sort of thing. The most recent time I saw it, again, late December 26th or 27th, I am getting ready for work. I get up about 4 in the morning, and I get to work about 6. And I don't drive, or I don't need to drive when I go to work. I walk or I take the bus, but this time I walked. As I'm walking, I would say I get out of the house like around 5, because it takes me about 45 minutes to an hour to get to work or what have you. And I'm walking down the street. It's just a straight path for me from where I'm living to where I'm working. And while I'm walking down the road, again, it's pretty dark. It's late in the year. It's still pretty dark, very early in the morning. So the sun isn't out or anything like that. And the road and the street is empty. Like a car, 1 or 2 cars pass every once in a while, but typically I'm completely by myself. And as I am walking, walking down the road, I see this figure in the middle of the road. And, again, typically I'm by myself, but people do, get up early, wait for the bus, what have you. I live in a relatively urban area, so, people just being in the middle of the road isn't necessarily unusual or a cause of concern for me personally. And I see this thing, or I see this like shape or silhouette or figure. And again, I'm just thinking to myself, it's not a big deal. It's just a guy, just ignore him, whatever. But as I'm getting closer, I am seeing this irregular shape to it again. Again, like you said, like a Kool-Aid Man jar kind of shape. It's, again, asymmetrical or non-symmetrical. And again, it's wearing, you know, um, I believe this time around it wasn't wearing the jacket or wasn't wearing the robe, if I remember correctly. But it's in the middle of the road, and as I'm getting closer to it, and I'm getting closer to it, and it's kind of like it's appearing more in the lights of the road, I am just recognizing the shape and texture of it. And, what happens is that, like I said, the gloves or the hands or the arm apparatuses, they're usually deflated or they're usually slack, but this time they were inflated and they were in a T-pose motion. Like it was, walking or kind of lumbering towards me, and the glass of it is kind of shifting, or the glass like sound or texture is shifting to it's kind of like it's shattering or crashing, and its arms are kind of extended out and it's coming towards me. And it's not coming towards me very quickly. It's not coming towards me like in like a huge speed or anything. It's just sort of like taking its time coming towards me, and it doesn't really make any kind of effort to immediately catch me or get me off guard or anything, but it has its hands out in a cross notion, and it's trying to come for me specifically. Like it's almost like it's trying to come in for a hug, or it's like trying to impede me. But again, like see this, I make no means to communicate or try to make sense of it, and I just try to walk around it, and I just floor it to work. And, I just get to work and I just continue with my day. Like, it's something that's unusual and it's extremely out of the norm, but it's something that I've grown used to or accustomed to, that even if it freaks me out, it's not really anything I can stop my day with. Like, I just continue to work as I usually do, even trying to avoid this thing.
The first time we talked, I had asked you which time you felt like you had the most interaction, because it seems like a lot of times these things show up and you're really kind of not interested in seeing what they're up to and just kind of try to get away from the scenario as fast as possible.
Yes.
But you did tell me the one time where you kind of felt like you were like cornered a little bit and you had a little bit more of a back and forth with one of these things. So why don't we go into that one too?
Okay, definitely. This was when I was going to school. The university that I went to, it was, no, it's not a relatively modern university, but like it has modern buildings, but of course it has buildings going back to the 70s or 80s. And so I'll have like basements or sub basements in which typically just used for storage and no one's really there. And lights or the maintenance of it is very infrequent. And working in the labs that I was working in, I typically, just working as an assistant more or less, would be a quester to go and gather like instruments or tools or equipment that's kept in storage. So I go to one of these basements or sub basements. I have a cart with me, and I'm taking an elevator, and I'm going down, and I turn on the lights to one of these basements, and the lights just kind of like, if there's like every light for like every square for the like ceiling, like every other light or every third light's turning on, because again, it's just in disrepair, disuse, or disuse, and so it's just not going to be maintenance frequently. So I'm just going into this like storage, space or room, and then just collecting things or checking off a list, and nothing is in there with me at this time. But as I'm going in further or deeper, I make a turnaround and I do see it, like where I was. Like, if I'm going down like a row between like two aisles, it is right behind me where I started at the aisle, and it's blocking my path, so I can't necessarily like go back around. And in this moment, like again, like I am kind of like having like a freak out or a panic, but it's not something in which I feel like is an immediate threat or danger, so I'm kind of just continuing my task. Like, I'm just like still collecting things and checking off my list and what have you. And like I said, it does communicate, it does speak, but it speaks in a very infrequent way. Like, I've described it almost like a number station in which it just says words in infrequent pauses, and if it says a sentence, it's very like garbled, or it's very infrequent, and I'm not really communicating to it. It's more of in the sense of like, I'm looking at it saying like, stay there, let me figure this out. Okay. I'm just kind of like doing one-offs with it as it's saying things. I'm like, okay, that's fine. All right, I understand. Okay. And I'm just circumnavigating around it. Like, I'm going around the room, the longest path, and just going to where I came from by just going around it. And it doesn't really seem to have the ability to move like too freely in the space, but where it was, it couldn't really move so accurately as if I couldn't see it or hear it, but it kind of jammed itself in where it was. And with the things that it was saying, again, it says things, and very infrequently it'll just say one word. They'll say things like stage, show, radio, observation. It will just kind of do these like partial phrases, and then it will say like, full phrases like, this is a game, you are a show, we like you, this is fun, we come down from above. Sometimes it says we come from somewhere else, we like to look at you. Things like that. It's not necessarily holding a conversation. It's just saying indistinctive phrases. And I'm just navigating around it. and I just get out the door, and when it says these things, I'm just saying like, okay, I understand. Okay, that's nice. Thank you. Almost kind of like, someone bothering you, but I just have a little bit more urgency to get out of the room than normal.
And what does the voice sound like?
Um, it sounds very like muffled, almost kind of like it's speaking through static. Like
Yeah.
I would say that like it sounds like it's speaking through like a really old speaker. Like it has like a kind of a high pitch or a grain or a resonance to it. It's not very clear, but I understand what it's saying.
Yeah, because the vibe that I'm getting from this is that it's not that like the thing is talking to you, it's almost like they have like pre-recorded words and phrases that they're like broadcasting
Yeah, no, I would say that's
out of the suit, and that it's not really like any sort of conversation at all. Like then maybe they can't even hear you.
yeah, like it's broad, it's speaking at me, not with me. Like it's saying things in my general direction for me to hear, but it's not waiting on a response. It's just telling me things.
So you've seen it 5 or 6 times, and we've gone through 3 of them. So real quick, I was kind of taking some mental notes, and I want to make sure that I'm understanding all this right. So the first time you saw it, it was kind of like at the edge of a street light at nighttime, or what was the time of day? Was it night or was it like dusk?
It was early morning. It was dark, but like I would say it was about like 4 or maybe even 5 in the morning.
Okay, so it was early in the morning, sort of dark enough for the streetlights to still be on, but was it like totally dark? Was it like winter dark, 4 in the morning, or?
Yeah, like on the edge of fall to winter, kind of dark.
Okay, and it was on the edge of a streetlight. And the second one that you told me, which was actually the most recent one, it was in the middle of the road, and that was also in the morning, right?
That is correct. And this was like the December, like late December.
Okay, and was that pretty early in the morning too, or was it like?
Yeah, this was early in the morning as well. Like I would say that this was on my way to work, so like I got up at 4, and I would say maybe I saw it around like 5:15, 5:20.
Okay, and then the third one that we talked about, where you were in that sort of basement area, what time of the day was that?
I would say that that would be late afternoon, just because with what I was doing, it was pertaining to class, but it was more of an after class or after school kind of thing. So like that would be like 3 or 4 in the afternoon, but it was in a building, and like it was in like a dilapidated part of the building.
So out of the other times that you've seen it, are there any of the times that we haven't talked about that were like particularly eventful or particularly interesting from that you would want to like bring up?
The only other time that was, I would say, out of the ordinary was when I've seen it, but it hasn't interacted with me. Like it just sort of sits and stands, and I see it very clearly, and it's very clearly trying to present itself to me known, but I have no one else around me to verify if the thing I'm looking at is real. And I don't, if I were to like run down and chase it, it would very well like have just disappeared, if you will. It has a very apparition kind of status to it.
So most of the other times that you've seen it, it's just been sort of like out a window.
Yeah, more or less.
Is it usually early in the morning like that, or is there not really any pattern at all with the time?
Usually it is early in the morning or late in the evening, but I would say that um, those big instances, that was early in the morning, but any other time I've seen it kind of in a one-off instance, it comes infrequently. It comes it seems to be at a matter of convenience. I don't think it's intentional. It's just kind of happenstance.
Okay, so it doesn't really seem like there's much of a pattern with the time.
Not particularly.
What kinds of places do you remember seeing it standing in the other events where you just kind of like saw it at a distance?
Um, another instance was, when I was at school, and this was in the middle of the day, and because where I live in the Southwest. I live in a desert, so it could be the middle of the day, and it could be like in a relatively like populated place, but you can be in the middle of a courtyard and no one will be there because it's just very hot and most people are usually taking shelter. And, in an instance in which I'm walking across campus trying to get to class or trying to just get to where I need to be, and I will kind of just see it, we'll have these armadas that sort of like make a corridor or a hallway, and I'll kind of just see a vague shape or notion of it, but like it's clear enough and the texture is fine enough for me to understand and recognize it and realize like that's it right there. But, you know, both I have no desire to interact with it because it's such an unusual circumstance, and also I just have somewhere else I need to be and I can't really chase it down or ask it any questions. And even if I was going to, I feel like it would just kind of ignore me or just like turn around and go away.
What do you think about your sort of like missing time sleepwalking experience at the beginning of this? Because that happened the day the first time, the day of the first time that you saw it was when that happened, right?
Mm-hmm. That yes.
Yeah, and that hasn't happened since or before.
No, like any time that I've ever found myself in an unusual place sleeping, I kind of just chalk it up to unusual sleep patterns and nothing out of the ordinary or extra normal happens during that period of time. But like the first time I saw it was that was like a one-off incident.
Yeah, and I mean, what are your thoughts on that potentially having something to do with why you seem to be seeing these things?
Um, outside of this particular thing, outside of this particular entity, I've always, for one reason or another, have kind of been generally attracted to unusual circumstances or out of the ordinary, instances or scenarios. You know, what I've read and or what I've looked into is I've found that a lot of people who pursue these interests or who have a lot of these experiences, they kind of have a tendency of happening around them more often than it does for I'm not going to say a normal person, but for other people, like the more you kind of seek these things out or the more it happens to you, it kind of accumulates. And for that reason, you know, you're going to see it more often. And I think with the sleep walking incident, I think my personal theory or opinion on it is that I happened to cross paths with it at I'm not going to say wrong place, wrong time, because I'm not going to put a negative connotation to it, but I think I was just in a particular place at a particular time, and I happened to cross paths with it, and ever since then, it's kind of like just stuck to me, kind of like glue or like a scent. I think, my sleepwalking was related to it. I think it was trying to like fish for someone or something, but for no particular reason. It doesn't necessarily seem like it's an agenda or it has any kind of logic to the thing it does. It's just sort of, when you beckon a stray cat to you for, no reason, essentially.
I assume you've probably thought about this a little bit because we talked a little bit in our off the record conversation, and you've talked about how you've like researched this kind of stuff and looked into this before. So what is your theory on what they are? Like what do you think this I guess, I mean, we don't even know if there's multiple, right? It could be the same one every time.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's a different thing. I think it's the same every time, personally. But in my opinion, and just, again, this is a very extremely specific circumstance that I haven't heard anyone else experience. I've heard very similar things, but nothing 100%. And I just am of the opinion that this is something that exists outside of outside of our dimension, outside of our universe, or it exists on a particular plane in which the rules are different for it, and so it's able to manifest the material or manifest itself into existence more concretely. The shape and the form it takes is illogical because that's the best thing that it can come up with at the time in order for it to like interact with the world. And its actions seem alien because it is, thinking at a different level or behavior. It would be like comparing the actions of something that exists in the 3D to the 2D. Like we would not be able to communicate or like give the minutia of our conversation to something that exists in a lower dimension than us. So I think that this is something that exists outside of our dimension, outside of space-time, and exists on a different material plane, and simply pops in and out and just takes a form and uses that form as a medium or a message to communicate whatever or however it needs to do. I don't think it's looking for me in particular. I think we happen to crossroads. Maybe it's off doing something else, but the way it travels and the path it travels, we happen to just bump into each other ever so often.
Yeah, it's really interesting. This is definitely the most bizarre thing that anybody's emailed me with. It seems like usually when you come across one of these things, it's already there.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever seen and do you usually just like get out of there before they like disappear? Like, have you ever seen one of these things like vanish like a ghost in front of you?
When it's closer to me and like it's trying to make a physical interaction with me, I usually just book it and I don't see it do anything. When it's in the more of a peripheral kind of view, if I look away, it will become scarce. Like it will, I could chalk that up to like it just has a better point of view or advantage to like, scurry away, as opposed to like when it's directly in front of me and it doesn't have an easier approach to kind of just like, pop in and out of existence. So yeah, I do think that it's operating on an vantage point that, we wouldn't be able to see. So it probably has a little bit of a better exit than, what we can understand.
Yeah, and it seems like they can't really move very fast or very effectively
No.
either. So I wouldn't imagine that they're like darting behind trees and stuff when you're not paying attention. That just seems a little bit out of character for how these things are.
Yeah, no, I don't think it's like jumping into a car or like hiding in an alleyway. I mean, I think if it does that just so it can be out of my line of perspective. I think that perspective plays a big part into it because, the whole idea of when you're observing matter or when you're observing particles, it changes the state of it from like, to a particle to a wave. I think that kind of plays a factor into it in which like looking at it changes the texture of it or changes the, I think looking at it freezes it or crystallizes it into a static state. And it can't really be as ethereal as it wishes to be. So when I'm looking away, it's able to kind of just like separate or what have you.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. The idea that like when you're looking at it, it's being like held in observation and is sort of like limited a little bit by the reality that we're living in. But then when it's not being observed, it can kind of like slip out.
No, I definitely think that like, that is I'm not going to say the most logical line of thinking for me, but that's the most sensible line of thinking for me and under the circumstance.
And the implication that I've got from you is not that you really view these things as like negative or like having some sort of like an agenda. They're just sort of a almost like an aspect of nature.
Yeah, I'm not like, thrilled when I see this happen, but like I don't get it's nothing threatening. I've never felt like, oh God, this thing's gonna hurt me. It's more in the sense of like you again. I've said that it's sort of like when you have a familiar path and you see like a street cat that you're familiar with, and obviously street cats don't like to interact with people that much, so they run away because they're like, oh God, this thing's much bigger than me or it's much stranger than me, so I'm gonna run away. I'm obviously the street cat in that circumstance, and that the thing is just like a guy, like, oh, hi, there you are again. Okay, well, goodbye. Like, see you next time, kind of thing.
Are there any sort of like closing details that you want to make sure we get in here at the end?
I unfortunately don't have like a grand narrative or reveal to it. I do think that it is, I'm not going to say it's a alien, but I'm going to say that it is alien to our understanding of the universe. I do think that, just based on what it is or who it is, I don't think it's just like, Lovecraftian, like indifferent, hostile force or presence. But I think that it's just, it's indifferent. This comes around, I've said that it's a little mischievous. It does seem like it kind of like thinks it's funny that like we bump into each other so often, the way it tries to interact with me or talk to me. But I don't think that, there's anything to be scared of. It's just like you said, it's a force of nature. It's the absurd making itself present in the world, I guess.
Like I'm sure I mentioned in the intro for this episode that I haven't actually recorded yet, this is by far the most bizarre and deranged story that anybody has contacted me with. I mean, the great thing about this story is that if you're like a real paranormal nerd, if you're like a real high strangeness sicko, this is like a classic, like 1950s, 1960s era humanoid sighting. Like before everybody like went crazy and now everything is like a gray alien, and before like, the post 2017 world where it's all, ufology is all about fucking being like a policy wonk for the Defense Department. Like this is a classic type of story. This is the type of thing that you used to read about. This is the type of shit that like John Keel would write about. Even though it's insane, there's a lot of stuff that sort of ties back into it in the deeper lore. But before I get into that, what'd you think, Olivia? What are you cooking over there? You were very confused the entire time. We had to explain. I had to really lay it out for you, the appearance of the thing, which is very confusing, and we will be posting a picture somewhere.
I was trying to like create a picture in my mind while he was talking about it, and it just turned into fuzz because I was like, there's like, my brain doesn't have like the pieces to put it together. Once you look at the picture, it makes a little bit more sense, but it does feel very like, almost like Twilight Zone-esque, where it's just like some absurd conglomeration creature.
Yeah, and I should preface this by saying, by the way, I'm not stupid. It has occurred to me that somebody could make up a story like this. But, like, it's such a weird type of thing to make up. It's not scary at all. This isn't something that you would see and be, like, terrified of. And it's not really like... I mentioned that I had sent out, like, DMs to other paranormal investigators to see if anybody's, like, not even, like... Because you see, like, illustrations in, like, old UFO books and stuff of all sorts of, like, weird-looking beings. I messaged some people to see, like, have you ever seen or heard anything that even remotely resembles this description? And I didn't hear back from anybody. Ryan Sprague, who's, like, one of the top UFO guys, emailed me back, or DM me back, and was like, I have no idea. The closest thing that I can think of that is, like, famous and well-established is Sam the Sandown Clown, which, let me pull up a picture of that.
I was going to say, I am not familiar.
This is a picture of Sam the Sandown Clown over here, and you can see, like...
Yeah, immediately I'm a huge fan.
Yeah, Sam the Sandown Clown is pretty incredible. He looks like, almost like a weird wooden 1950s, 1960s, like, toy robot, where his eyes are, like, these painted triangles, and he looks sort of like a golden age of sci-fi clown. And he's got a little microphone that's attached to a little karaoke machine, and he has to speak through the karaoke machine. That
is so cool.
And Sam the Sandown Clown, like, he has the same vibe as this, and in the story, the kids are, like, out in what is, like, this happens in the UK somewhere, and they're out in what is essentially, like, a bog, and they see, like, this little tent, and they go out, and he's in the tent, and the first thing he says is, like, one of the most iconic lines in all of the high strangeness lore, which is, hello, and I am all colors Sam, which, like, what? It's like, really disjointed, and the way that he talks is, like, weird like that. And at one point, the kids ask him they ask him if he's a ghost, and he says, kind of, but not really. And then they ask him, what are you? And he just says, you know. So, like, he's, like, really cryptic in the way that he, like, talks and acts. And he has kind of the same thing that this Kool-Aid Man entity has, where he seems really mechanical, and it seems like he might be in like a suit and is like unable to interact with the outside world to the point where he needs to talk like through a microphone attached to a speaker. Like that's definitely the most similar thing. I'm not going to go into the extremely deep Sam the Sandown clown lore. If you want like a really good, really in-depth breakdown, the podcast Astonishing Legends did like, I think it might even have been a 2-part episode on that story. And that's the closest thing we have that I'm aware of so far in like the broader paranormal lore. There's a lot of stuff about this that ties into like the Fae. So one of the patterns that I noticed just listening to the story is that there's a lot of like liminality to this. Like every time he sees them, well, not every time, but most of the time when he sees them, it's either early in the morning or like late in the evening. So it's right around when the sun is either going up or coming down. And like that sort of twilight timing is supposed to be when, in like old school fairy folklore, that's supposed to be the time of the day where like the veil is the thinnest. In a lot of sources, like the fairy dimension is described as being permanently twilight, where it's like always like dusky, like right when the sun's about to go down or come up. And not only that, but like the first time he sees it, it's like right on the edge of a street light in like the middle of the road, which is like a really odd spot to be. And
the
then,
spookiest thing you could do.
Yeah, and then when he sees it in the basement, he's like down in like creepy sort of like liminal basement tunnels, which is, and so there's like a strong element of that lines up with like fairy shit. And then I have in my notes, and I can't remember if I like really clarified this or if it was just something that like I wrote down in my notes. At one point he sees it in December, and that sighting was like real close to the winter solstice, which is another like interesting coincidence. In the times when he sort of barely sees it, it's right at the edge of his perception. It's like I can kind of barely see like the outline of it, or like I kind of saw it when I was like looking out a window and it's clearly there, but then it just kind of like, it's always like right at the edge of perception. There's just so much stuff that points to the idea of the liminal, which is really big in high strangeness and really big in traditional fairy folklore. And also this entire story takes place in the Southwest, which is one of the most freakish parts of the country. There was a NASA mapping of the Earth's entire magnetic field, and the 2 biggest magnetic field anomalies in the country are Sedona, Arizona, where all the quartz is. So there's like a big magnetic anomaly over that part of the Southwest, and a big magnetic anomaly over Kentucky that's literally called the Kentucky anomaly. And a lot of people in the deep paranormal field think that the reason that the Southwest and Appalachia specifically are so freakish is because of that magnetic anomaly. So like this entire story and setup just screams old school high strangeness fairy lore.
I thought the part about it being like gaseous in like with like the deflated gloves, and then I think he said later on that they like were inflated in a different sighting.
Yeah. That's
so interesting, and it seems so like I've never heard of anything like that before. It sounds like a Doctor Who character.
Yeah, it's so bizarre. Like you wouldn't, and it really does obviously seem like they're in a suit because they can't really move very well. It doesn't seem like, and like I said, we don't even know if it's like one thing or multiple. They can't really move very well. It doesn't even seem like they're really talking. It seems like they have like a pre-recorded, like set of phrases. It would literally be like the equivalent of if a human was wearing like a fucking Scooby-Doo diving suit to go underwater and talk to like fish people, but we couldn't talk, so there was like a speaker on the outside of the suit that was broadcasting like, we're from the surface. Here's hello in like 19 different languages and like that kind of thing. And maybe it broadcasts like the sound of a plane or something for like, it was like, it just seems like something that we would do if we were trying to make contact with an alien and we needed to be like wearing a suit that was so restrictive that we couldn't really like move or talk.
Well, that makes me think like, is it even actually a being, or is it just like a thing something sent in.
Yeah,
you know what
like,
I mean?
Yeah, is it like a drone?
Yeah,
is it like
exactly.
A robot? Yeah.
Because that's kind of what it seems like to me. But then he said he gets like a feeling from it. You know what I mean? Like it has like a vibe to it, which I'd feel like a drone wouldn't.
Yeah, but then again, when you're seeing something this weird, it would be hard to not like feel like you were seeing. Like I have to imagine that when you see something this insane, it puts you in like a certain frame of mind.
I think your brain would immediately try and like humanize it a little bit.
Yeah, like have you ever had an experience where you see like, okay, I'll give you an example. One time when I still lived in the old apartments that I used to live in, I was driving home after a night shift, and I wasn't like delirious, but I was like pretty tired. And when I was driving into the parking lot of the parking complex, my headlights caught it was a cat, but the way the cat was like sitting, it looked like a little monkey crouched down the way that like runners crouch at the starting line. And it was about to like charge my car. And for like a quarter of a second, I literally thought that like a little tiny capuchin monkey was about to like football charge at my car. And my brain, like, I literally was like, is that a monkey? Is that a goblin? Am I seeing a being? Like I was like going insane. And then it moved, it like changed the way that it was sitting, and I realized it was a cat. But if you've ever had like an experience like that where like you're seeing something insane and your brain is trying to process it, like you know exactly what I'm talking about, where like you immediately feel like you're in like a movie where you're like, is this like a joke? Like what am I even seeing right now? And then I wanted you to bring up the thing that you said earlier about how you think that it's crazy that this guy like doesn't try to engage at all.
Oh yeah, like I feel like after like the third time, when it's becoming like, oh, I guess I just see this guy around, I'd be like, hey, what's up? Like, what are we doing here? But I guess I also understand like not wanting to interact with it because it's probably scary as hell.
Well, and the interesting thing about that is that this is like really, really, really common in people's stories. Some people call it paranormal apathy, where like these people are going through totally ridiculous and insane circumstances, and it doesn't really seem like they even have the ability to confront it. Like if you watch Love and Saucers, which is one of my all-time favorite documentaries, about a guy named David Huggins who has like all these wild sexual encounters and abduction experiences with a particular female gray alien. And at one point the documentarian is like, hey, have you ever like asked them where they're from? And he literally is like, you know what? I never thought to ask. And on one hand, that's insane. But on the other hand, it feels like if beings like this existed and they were going to like come down and interact with people, they would be interacting with people like that are like so humble and so nonchalant that they're not even going to like turn this into a thing. It's not like it almost seems like those types of people are targeted by these types of beings in a way.
That's a good point, because if I saw something like that, I feel like my brain would immediately be like, okay, here's your like 35 list of questions you're gonna ask next time you see this thing, and that's probably why I've never seen one. Yeah, because I'm just gonna bother them.
And there's even examples like in the Betty and Barney Hill abduction story that everybody has heard 1,000 times. We all know it. They're driving on the road and they get picked up by the aliens, and they did do an examination. At one point in that, Betty finishes her examination first, and she's waiting for Barney to come back. And in the meantime, she's with one of these like tall gray aliens and is asking him stuff. And any case where like somebody has downtime where they have a chance to ask questions, it never fails that like the being always gets like a little annoyed. They get like frustrated that you're even like trying to think about it and trying to like ask questions and parse it. So that has always been interesting to me. And I don't know if that's because like I would have to imagine that if you're like interdimensional and you're able to like, you're like perceiving reality at a totally different level than we are currently, it would be really annoying for like somebody to ask you really trivial questions about like, where are you? It would be like if your dog suddenly like had the ability to speak and was like asking you really obnoxious questions about like their dog food or something. Like that's like the level of like banal it would be, and it would like get annoying. And you'd be like, dude, I can't even like describe. You're not going to be able to comprehend that what happens is we take like a scrap cow and then grind it up through like a gigantic eldritch machine, and then that gets like pressed and tried out. And like, you're not going to be able to understand the process or the technology behind where your dog food comes from. So I'm not even going to like bother trying to explain this to you. It's better if you just think this is like a mystical experience, because you can't even like, you wouldn't even be able to like understand what I would need to tell you. And at one point in the, I think it's in the Betty and Barney Hill story, the alien straight up was like, you would not be able to get like how we got here. And then there was another, man, I wish I could remember what it was, but I remember there was another story where a guy gets abducted and is talking to gray aliens, and they tell him, he like asks them where they're from, and they basically say, we are from so far into the future that like you wouldn't even be able to understand how far into the future we are from. So there's like all you need to know is that we're from really far into the future. It really seems like they're on a level that's so far removed from ours that they wouldn't even really be able to communicate it anyway, even if they were confronted with somebody who was asking questions. And I guess the last kind of angle that I wanted to take with this is, so there's this idea of like the filter hypothesis for consciousness, which is basically that like your brain has evolved specifically to only really deal with stuff that's important for your survival. You perceive like trees with fruit on them and they're colorful because like you need the fruit to live. You perceive like the bear as being scary, and you like perceive all these things, but you're perceiving objects that are like directly relevant to like whether or not you're going to live or die, because that's what like natural selection would select for. There's this guy named Donald Hoffman who is an expert in cognitive science and like evolution and consciousness. He got together with a team and they came up with this process where they came up with like a mathematical equation to calculate the percentage of actual reality that you would evolve to see. So they took this idea that like your brain only evolves to perceive things that are relevant to your survival. And they were like, okay, so if we assume that your brain, that you evolved to do that, how much of what you're seeing is like actual real reality? And how much of what you're seeing is like the fake evolved version that your brain is making up that's just relevant to you living? And the way the math works out is that there is a 0% chance that you're seeing base reality at all. Like a literally mathematically 0% chance that anything that you're seeing is in any way real reality. And to give you like the metaphor that he always uses, if you look at your computer desktop, you've got like all these icons and shit that you can move around and stuff. But what that desktop really is like billions of ones and zeros that are organized in a way. And we had to build an operating system that would like show you all of those ones and zeros as like colorful little symbols that you can move around, because otherwise it would, you wouldn't be able to do anything with it. It would just be like a mess of information. And basically their argument is that base reality is this like extremely complicated, impossible to understand, like maelstrom of information going on all the time. And that our brains have evolved to filter that down into like a really simplified version of reality that we can like understand and interact with. Like if you think about a tree is like trillions and trillions of chemical reactions in each cell happening like every minute, and all of like the stuff that's going on in the roots where it's got like the fungal symbiotic relationships where all these like hundreds of species are intercommuning with each other. It's got like a bird nest in the fucking branch, and that's part, they're eating bugs out of the tree. Like it's this whole insanely complicated process. But to us, we're just like, okay, that's a tree. That's all we need to know. We don't need to worry about the rest of the stuff that's going on. That's just a tree. Maybe we can cut it down for firewood or whatever. And in this story with Riley and these beings, it all starts with him having like a disassociative state where he like wakes up and has missing time and has been wandering around his apartment complex for like an unknown amount of time. Like he wakes up in this weird fugue state. And I wonder if something like that isn't indicative of the possibility that like, I don't want to say that there's something like wrong with his brain, but what I mean is that there's something about that experience that might hint towards a little bit more of like base reality is filtering into his like sensory system than a normal person's, and maybe it has something to do with that fugue state that he experienced. And that is why all of a sudden after that, he's seeing these things that, as far as we know, could just be around all the time, but we just pass each other like ships in the night because we can't like see them or perceive them at all.
I would just wonder what they would look like to us then.
Like if they're
like, is that just like actually a trash can that I'm seeing?
Well, I think it would be that like,
I guess I don't know what you mean.
it isn't just that you're not seeing it, it's that like you're not seeing it at all, and like you wouldn't.
Oh, it's not like it's cloaked for me and he can see through the cloak.
Yeah, it's not that it's like invisible, it's that like you literally have no way of like perceiving or interacting with it at all. You would just be like phasing through it. Like you're not even like in the same reality.
Oh, okay. So he's got like an extra layer.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And this is like really similar to the ultra terrestrial theory, that there might be like an entire sort of like hidden biosphere on the Earth that is like not accessible to us. And if that was the case, and they are like a little bit more advanced than us technologically, and they can kind of like poke through, it would make sense that they're poking through with this really shitty, really clunky, really like poorly designed either suit or like machine that can barely function here and can't really like do much of anything. Because if there's anything to any of these like theories at all, I would imagine that either like the terms that the hippies always use is like low, like increasing or decreasing vibration. They're always like, oh, you gotta like increase your vibration to get into like the higher existence. If there's like any, I don't think it's literally like that, but if there's like some metaphorical way that you could like vibe down or vibe up into like extra dimensional perception, it would probably be really, 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 really difficult to do. And the technology would probably be like extremely expensive to invest in, and like you wouldn't be able to like, it would be like the equivalent of our original moon rover. Like it's not going to be like a very sophisticated piece of technology. And this type of interdimensional thing is also sort of supported in the part of the story where he's in the basement and it just sort of phases into the basement like behind him. He would have had to have walked by where it was at, and then he turns around and it's where he like walked through that spot.
Oh, that's a good point. I didn't even think about that.
Yeah, so I really like this story. I'm glad it got called in. These kinds of like classic high strangeness stories are the ones that I like a lot. Honestly, at the end of the day, who knows if this is true? Who knows if this is some sort of a hallucination? But what I will say is, at this point of us recording this show right now, this show does not exist. Riley did not use his full name. He's not going to get like any attention from this. He's not going to get a paycheck. He's not going to get every paranormal podcast in the business beating down his door to like tell a story. He's probably not going to write a book. Like he doesn't really have anything to gain from this. And as far as he knows, this show is never even going to make it to air because we're still in production. Like there's no episodes of the show that you can listen to. There is no podcast. So you have to imagine, if he's making this up to just lie to me specifically and is getting nothing in return. So like, I guess it could be fun to lie to people, but there's not really very much of a motivation to create a story like this. And I want to thank Riley for coming on and telling this story and confusing the shit out of everybody with the description of this insane thing, which you will be able to find a picture of. Riley did draw a detailed diagram, and I will post that definitely in the Discord when this episode comes out, and probably also on Twitter. And I guess take it to the outro. Welcome back to the outro segment of Deep Weird. This episode is fantastic. I honestly cannot believe that I was lucky enough to have somebody call in with such a unique experience. I'm still trying to find examples of anything that's similar to this at all. The closest one that I have been able to find since sort of wrapping up production on this episode is John Tenney, who is an all-timer UFO high strangeness writer and investigator, has a case that he has talked about that he investigated in Michigan where people reported sightings of these beings with a fish tank-like chest and legs that were just bent metal bars, which does not really line up exactly with what Riley is talking about here, but I have a sneaking suspicion that is as close as we're going to get. But on the off chance that you have seen a Kool-Aid Man, or you have any other paranormal experience at all, please send us an email at deep.weird@gmail.com. You can find us over on Twitter at deepweirdpod. We also have an active Discord community. You can find the link to that on my old Probably Jacob YouTube channel in the description of any video. We'll have it up on Twitter, I'm sure. It'll be easy to find. If you would like to support the podcast, there's two things that you can do. You can head over to the Patreon and support us that way. Or, and this one is much more important, if you have been enjoying the show, please give us a 5-star review wherever you can. Deep Weird is written and produced by me, Jacob Pittman, and the music that you've heard throughout is produced by Griffin Dodefray. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.